I just want to introduce one more person who's on the screen here. So Pujo Smedi, who is my co-author on our forthcoming book called Plantation Life, Corporate Occupation in Indonesia's Plantation Zone. And this is work that we've been working on together really beginning in 2010. It's taken a long time to bring it to this level of, analysis and thought, but Pujo's been part of that right from the beginning. So I just want to acknowledge he's here. Unfortunately, he can't stay for the Q&A, so that's unfortunate, but he's here at the moment. So to put that on the table. So the title, In the Wake of the Plantation, Law and Human Rights in Indonesia, 1870 to 2020. So scholars working mainly in the Americas. Sorry, I'm gonna have to close a window. I've got the noise outside.
Yeah, that's better.
It has, it's like some big concrete mix that decided to start outside. Okay. Scholars working mainly in the Americas, who in some ways I would say, consider that they own the concept of the plantation. There's been a lot of discussion of plantations in the American sphere, North America and South America and the Caribbean. But they've been arguing that the emergence of plantations around 1600 reshaped the world order, embedding racialized modes of social, political, and economic organization that resonated far beyond plantation borders and still do. So they've dubbed this world-making character of plantations and the worlds that plantations made then and still make now, what they call the Plantation Ocean, like the era of plantations, which they argue began around 1600 and still persists in the Americas. So inspired by this line of inquiry and focusing on Indonesia, what I will argue in this lecture today is that in Indonesia too, plantations have made new worlds, both at the local scale where plantations are located, and for a period of more than a century at the scale of the nation as well. So I'll begin my lecture by presenting some findings from ethnographic research I've been carrying out with Pujo Smedi from Gadjah Mada, to talk about what we found happening among people who live in a plantation zone or who work on plantations and whose lives are radically transformed by plantation presence. Now, this in some ways is to be expected. You'd expect that a massive corporate plantation would change your world, right? That's sort of obvious. More surprising for us was the finding that the arrival of plantation corporations in village spaces radically undermines the status of villagers as rights-bearing citizens and erodes their access to justice or really to any form of legal or political protection. So that radical transformation of the nature of citizenship and rights was something we had not really anticipated, and that came out of our work. Plantations do not do this incidentally, we argue, but systematically and routinely for the reasons that I will explain. The role of plantations in configuring national, political, social, and legal regimes, again, was not obvious to us at first. One can readily see how a particular legal regime enables the presence of plantations, pro-plantation laws, for example. But how does the presence of or desire for the presence of plantations shape the law? How does it shape national configurations of power and politics? How does it shape the nature of citizenship in the nation as a whole, even in places far from plantations, where no one has ever seen a plantation or imagined plantations as a shaping force? So that would, if we are right, then that would bring us into the domain of the era of plantations, even for people who have never seen one, and many Indonesians never have. So in what sense then have plantations in Indonesia been governed by, as they have produced, race-like social divides? This is again a theme of the work on plantations in the Americas. They've called plantations race-making machines. At first glance, this does not seem so obvious in the Indonesian context, but the more we dug into it, the more I would say there is a story there that we need to explore. So starting first then with plantations and citizenship and rights at a local scale. I'm just briefly going to share my screen so you can see just a few pictures. Obviously, plantations create new world because of this sort of thing, the way they transform the landscape, There's a radically linear form. Everything that was there before, every village tree, mango tree, durian tree, whatever was there before has gone. So there's that kind of world making, which is infrastructural. And this is true also of, sorry, if this is going to work doing this on Word. Sorry. Also, you know, carving into hillsides. Are you seeing my screen? Are you seeing the pictures? Yeah. So there's that kind of infrastructural change. There is the arrival of new people, in this case, plantation workers in their little houses. These may seem to be very modest houses, as indeed they are, but from the perspective of local people, these are often sites actually of privilege. These people have electricity supply, they have tin roofs, they have water, and a certain kind of modern life, which the plantations promise to deliver, but in fact do not deliver for the local population, only for the workers, most of whom are migrants. There's the infrastructure that plantations bring, often rather faulty, as you can see in this picture. You know, poorly maintained roads, basically a sunk truck in a pool of mud is a fairly common sight in our research area. There's also this kind of infrastructure, which one might think of in a sort of shock and awe. You know, these massive factories there in the landscape, and they have an effect as well on people. It's like, what kind of powers are involved here to produce something like this in the middle of the Kalimantan interior is something that, you know, many people are impressed by. Definitely that's going to change things. Okay, and then I want to just show this picture, if this is going to work. Here, sorry. Control. Right. And this is in some ways, I think, the most shocking of all. So this is from a satellite picture. I need to zoom in. Hold on. How do I do that? Right. It's not behaving correctly. I'm just getting flustered. This is showing the extent. Is it going to show? Well, interesting. It's not working today. That's never happened before. Well, it looks like that for some reason this program's not working correctly today. But this is a program where you can zoom in on oil palm plantations, and what you see is vast swathes of Indonesia, right across Sumatra, huge areas of Kalimantan, basically light up bright orange, with the extraordinary expanse of plantation agriculture right across the country. So that's also obviously a major world-making effect because of the sheer size and scale of the expansion of the plantations. Okay, so what do plantations do then on the ground? They create wealth for some people, provide facilities for selected workers to lead exemplary modern lives. For others, they create impoverishment, abandonment, polluted water, and a general sense of despair. The surprising part that we discovered was really the shift in citizenship. So why did this occur? Plantation corporations are present at the invitation of national and district governments. They're there with their blessing and with their permission. They have a dual mandate, like the colonial dual mandate. On the one hand, to create wealth for shareholders, and secondly, they're there on the invitation of the government to bring prosperity and development into rural areas. And this is written into the plantation law. This is supposedly the purpose of plantations. You know, they can bring development to our country. There's no confirmation, actually, that corporate plantations do bring any such beneficial results. But in the name of these benefits, government officials at all levels are tasked with assisting plantations, and they are expected to smooth their path. So at village, sub-district, and district level, officials are recruited onto official land release teams and coordination teams, where they are paid an official monthly salary by the plantation corporation to provide assistance. So this isn't under the table payment. This is the official status of government officials in multiple departments who are appointed to coordinate with the plantation corporation, which basically means to provide it with assistance and to take its part. Plantation corporations also pay holiday bonuses to officials in multiple government departments: Labour Department, Environment, Local Government, Religious Affairs, the Land Bureau, and so on. Hence, in both formal and informal ways, government officials are paid for their loyalty and compliance to the corporation. As a result, they're obliged to support plantations, and they cannot effectively support workers or villagers who are harmed by corporate presence and whose legal or human rights are infringed. To hear from one villager, Ibu Marlina, a villager whose land was swallowed up by the plantation, in her words, "My mother was a widow. We were 5 children. She was raising us by tapping rubber, and we grew our own rice and vegetables. Our family's rubber garden was right there by the bridge. Then the village head took the land. We used to have something of our own, even though it wasn't much. Now all this land belongs to the company. We just have to take orders from them and hope they give us work." Plantations then create entire plantation zones in which ordinary village citizenship, we argue, is effectively suspended. Legally, formally, villagers' rights are intact. And this is because the corporations are only responsible for their workers inside the plantation. They're not responsible for all of these villages whose zone, whose land, whose territory for hundreds of kilometers they have occupied. So legally, formally, these are ordinary villages with ordinary sets of rights. But in fact, they are weakened because officials do not play a mediating function or take their part or support them really in any way or any significant way, especially vis-a-vis the corporation. So the suspension of effective citizenship for huge swaths of the population, we argue that around 15 million Indonesians live in what we call plantation zones, is surely the making of a new world. The most useful way we found to theorize this dimension of plantation presence is in terms of what we're calling corporate occupation, which has a lot in common with colonial occupation or military occupation. Corporations occupy not just concession land, but the surrounding territory, and effectively they occupy the state by making officials at all levels into collaborators. The result is to make the status of ordinary villagers ambiguous. Legally, citizenship in plantation zones is unchanged, but in practice it is degraded as officials and local leaders are allied with the occupying force. Every dimension of life in a plantation zone is shaped by corporate presence: access to land, work, water, pollution, pests. Yet plantation corporations have no legal responsibility for these surrounding villagers and can ignore them entirely or treat them, as we discovered, as if they simply were not there. So this rather bleak description raises the question, what kind of state is it that favors corporations and promotes their interests at the expense of its own citizens? Why are citizens so powerless vis-a-vis plantation corporations and their state protectors? How does such a state come to be, and how is it sustained? So these are the questions that I want to address in the second part of this lecture, more historical and national in scale. So at the core of the utter erosion of rights in the plantation zone is what anthropologist, historian Anne Stoller calls imperial debris, the racialized residue of colonial rule. So I have to explain what I mean by this. The prerequisite for the plantation format is the classification of uncultivated or mixed-use landscapers and small farms as inefficient and without value, and the classification of the people who live and work on these lands as without value as well, whether as farmers or workers. The natives on the spot could and should be displaced because they're not doing anything useful there. So this is a colonial premise which is repeated in every colonial situation. The colonizers justify their presence on the grounds that the locals on the spot are wasting God's bounty, are not doing anything useful with the resources, require tutelage from a superior power. But there's always a racialized element in the sense that the people on the spot, the natives, have to be understood as radically different and as deficient, as incapable of effective production, of organizing their lives in a suitable way, and therefore requiring colonial presence. So in Southeast Asia, this set of ideas was captured by what Said Hussein Alatas called the myth of the lazy native. Basically, native inefficiency and waste is the alibi for corporate presence. Reciprocally, the desire for corporate control requires the classification of natives as inefficient. Hence, in Indonesia, as in the Americas, plantations in the colonial period, and I would argue still today, operate as race-producing machines. Right? They produce this difference in the population between people capable of running plantations and planning them and being part of this kind of modern economy, and the people whose lives and production are devalued and set aside as deficient. So I've made some big claims here, and I now want to delve into them a bit more deeply by attending first to productivity and then to law, and then finally to the exercise of power with impunity, which means really that any guarantee of rights disappears. So first of all, on the front of production, the premise of the corporate plantation, one could say its enabling fiction, is the racialized argument that Indonesian farmers are incapable of farming efficiently, hence land should be granted to plantation corporations so that they can produce efficiently and generate profits for their shareholders and revenues for the state. To sustain this fiction, this myth, I would argue, requires that centuries of enthusiastic cash crop production by Indonesian villagers, beginning with the first coffee boom around 1700, must be overlooked or discounted. Or in fact, their production must actually be suppressed to produce the impression that only plantation corporations can do the job. So we've seen this repeatedly in Indonesia, where plantation corporations claim productive efficiency, but are actually very anxious that the farmers roundabout will outcompete them, as they did with rubber during the rubber boom, where farmers enthusiastically adopted this crop and eventually drove the less efficient plantations into bankruptcy. Tea plantation owners wanted the villagers to be denied the right to grow tea, again, for fear they would outcompete. Coffee, similarly, tobacco, locals were forbidden from growing it, not because they were incapable, because in fact, probably because they were too capable. But this is the fiction which has to be sustained, right? That only plantation corporations can grow these crops and can do the job. Shockingly, we would argue, the myth that Indonesian farmers cannot farm efficiently is still in place, and it's used to justify the contemporary expansion of plantations. So here is one district official. You don't have to take my word for it. Here he is speaking at a ceremony for the opening of a new oil palm plantation in West Kalimantan in 2017. And in his words, "The government can build some infrastructure, but to develop people's economy, investment and the private sector is needed. We can't hire everyone as government officials, military or police. That's why the district has opened its doors as wide as possible to the private sector." So according to this narrative, development of the, quote, people's economy is the task of corporations, which are licensed, in fact, to destroy the people's economy, in this case, 8,000 hectares of village rubber groves and rice fields, a destruction that closed off farming futures for generations to come, because plantation corporation licenses now can go up to 90 years. In fact, automatic extensions in some cases. Note also that for this district head, development is equated with the provision of salaried jobs, like those of government officials, military or police, that's what he names, or presumably formally employed full-time plantation workers. So what that phrasing does is it radically discounts the value of smallholder livelihoods, and it discounts the social value of the farming families who pursue non-salaried livelihoods, even when they make good money and effectively effectively develop their villages on their own. So in the case of this plantation, the local villagers insisted that they are already developing very nicely. You know, they have, their children are in high school in the local city, they have satellite TV. It's like, you know, do not bring your development here. We are actually managing fine on their own. But all of that had to be radically discounted and set aside in the documents which conveyed an image of a static and backward place in need of corporate development. So given this line of thinking, and here I'm focusing on production, we argue that plantations are premised on, as they also create, a deep, enduring, race-like divide, not just between colonial officials and natives, but still today in contemporary Indonesia, where government officials, salaried people, and their corporate allies position themselves as both different from and absolutely superior to ordinary Indonesians, both urban and rural, who continue to occupy the position of the perennially deficient, lazy native of colonial times. So the colonial era practice of evaluating people and their productivity around a racial axis was also entrenched in the legal order, and that's what I will turn to now. So in her book, The Colonial Lives of Property, Brenna Bandar argues that racial or race-like divisions are constitutive of colonial and contemporary land regimes, in which the association between a kind of person, a kind of land use, and the inferiority of customary property rights is circular. In Indonesia, the chain of reasoning goes something like this. The National Land Agency grants concessions to plantation corporations on the grounds that they can utilize the land efficiently. Implicitly, customary landholders cannot use land efficiently. Hence, their customary land rights do not qualify as full property rights. Their low productivity and incomplete property rights confirm that they are people of low value. As people of low value, they cannot be expected to use land efficiently and can legitimately be displaced by corporations. So I'm trying to give you a sense of the kind of circular logic here in which the evaluation of a kind of person, a kind of production, and a kind of deficient legal right confirm each other in terms of the absolute deficiency of the population and of a race-like nature. So this, I would argue, was the logic behind Indonesia's, or the Dutch East Indies 1870 land law, a key piece of legislation which claimed that all land was the domain of the government, except for tiny areas that were recognized as individual private property. So the purpose of the 1870 land law was to free up land to allocate for plantation, timber and mining concessions. That's why such a law was needed, with plantations in mind. I would argue that the 1870 colonial land law is still basically in place. Its racialized premise was retained in the clause of the National Constitution that gives the state the right to control and allocate land and issue corporate land concessions, you know, the hak kuasai negara, right? And the idea that the government controls land on behalf of the people and is entitled to grant concessions. Through this law and its successors, the customary land rights of most rural people in Indonesia are of a weak and inferior kind. Their land rights are discounted because the value of the people and their productivity is also discounted. This is the racial logic at work. The weakening of customary rights by the 1870 land law was the historic betrayal that Van Vollenhoven attempted to redress by arguing that rural Indonesians also have territories, not just individual rights, but territories, which one might think of as kind of the indigenous counter to the concession. Like they too have territories, whole territories, swaths of land that they hold and govern according to their own customs, and these territories should be recognized and protected. Sadly, his advocacy for the recognition of customary land rights on a territorial basis was not successful. And to this day, corporate concessions are legally entrenched, mapped and protected, but customary land rights, whether collective or individual, have no equivalent status. Decades of work by activists, many of whom I see are here on this the screen today, present listening to this, basically have not changed this situation. You know, the extent of territorial recognition of customary rights is minuscule in comparison to 15 million hectares of corporate land concessions and expanding, right? So basically the concessions are winning, and they're winning fast and expanding. And any attempt, you know, which Van Vollenhoven began, you know, to try to push back, to territorialize customary land in response to this immense expanding plantation frontier, has effectively not worked. So I want to turn now to the regime of impunity that has been entrenched in Indonesia since 1965 in order to show that impunity also has plantation roots. So this is the third part of my argument. So in the 1950s, plantation workers and farmers were at the forefront of a movement to radically transform the colonial order and the hierarchies that had survived independence and were still entrenched. So, you know, in discussions with Pudra around this, you know, he always emphasizes that under in the 50s, plantation workers were told by their union, you know, you are workers. That's an important role in society. You are building the nation. You are producing goods that we need as a country. Basically, this idea that through their work, they were fully valuable and enfranchised citizens. And therefore, also, they were not just you know, backward people to be kicked around, but citizens, you know, citizens and workers, you know, entitled to rights. So that kind of thinking, which would have been a radical transformation of the racialized colonial order in which deficient subjects may or may not get protection, but they certainly don't get rights, was something that the Communist Party and the unions of the time were really working to transform. They pushed back against land grabbing, they reoccupied unused plantation land, and they mobilized successfully to improve the conditions for plantation workers. So that arguably was a time in which the concept of a non-racialized, fully enfranchised citizen, you know, could have emerged. But in the period 1965 to 66, these unions were stopped by the military with outside support. 500,000 people with communist affiliations were murdered, and a great many of them were members of plantation workers and peasant unions. So I want to show you a newsreel from 1967 that makes this link specific, that makes the argument I'm making here about the link to impunity rather shockingly explicit. So I hope I can do this. The screen share didn't work brilliantly last time, so just bear with me a sec, because I want you to see this, because you can see from this that I'm not making it up. Wait, I've got it. I've got to share the screen now. I've got it lined up. Sorry. Okay, so what I'm going to show you is a newsreel from 1967 from CNN, and it's 4 minutes long, so just bear with me. It's a shocking watch, but I think it's important.
300,000 people killed in Indonesia during the last 16 months are about 100,000 more than the total military casualties of all sides in Vietnam since 1960. In many cases, entire families were liquidated, but still there are thousands of widows like this young mother. Without trial, her husband and 300 other alleged communists were shot by the army and dumped into this mass grave. 50,000 in all were killed just on the romantic island of Bali. A young college professor named Rata, who helped remove the communists, explained how they went about it.
Bali is such a beautiful island. The people are so attractive, climate so lovely.
it's hard to believe that so many unpleasant things went on here in the last year.
Yeah, but now Bali become more beautiful without communists. And this is the duty of the Balinese people to clean their own island from the communist influence. This is the holy duty. And we did it. In Bali, it's really, we did it.
What actually happened here in this village?
Yeah, the story here is because some of the communist leaders from this village realized that they did wrong already, and they come to the village council and ask to the village council when village council will clean their village from the communist people.
You mean the communists themselves asked to be killed?
Some of them, and then the village council make a list who must be killed from that village, and some of them want to be killed, but they ask a time. For example, if you want to kill me, you can kill me the next day, and now give me a chance to pray to the temple, to the village temple, to say goodbye to all of my relatives, and the next morning I'm ready to be killed. So the next morning or next evening, the villagers bring him here and kill him by sword.
They killed him with a sword.
Yes, with a sword.
Stab
them. One time, killed, buried it, and put the stone like this. This one, so the family can recognize the next morning where's the family buried.
What did you do to erase or cleanse the communists or the communist sympathizers in your village from their ideas?
Yeah. And later, all the communists, for example, come to the village council, and then they told that they will swear on earth they will not become a member or sympathizer of Communist Party anymore.
Well, how did you hold them to their promise?
That is why we cannot hold that. That's why we leave it to the God, and we decided to hold the purification ceremony for them in the village temple, that the God will see them promise and swear on earth. That is the best way. Because, for example, if they come back again to the Communist Party, we don't know, but the God will know it.
But bad as things are, one positive fact is known. Indonesia has a fabulous potential wealth in natural resources, and the new order wants it exploited. So they're returning the private properties expropriated by Sukarno's regime. Goodyear's Sumatran rubber empire is an example. It was seized in 1965. The Rubber Workers Union was communist-run, so after the coup, many of them were killed or imprisoned. Some of the survivors, you see them here, still work the rubber, but this time as prisoners and at gunpoint. When the government ran things, they enlarged the staff, built houses and schools, and raised wages. Although production remained about the same, operating costs quadrupled. Profits went out the window, and with them, a vital source of export revenue vanished. The new order wants Goodyear back, and they, like dozens of other foreign capitalists, are anxious to return because the wealth is there, not just rubber, but oil, tin, lumber, spice, almost everything.
Okay, so hopefully that was sufficiently chilling, but what you see there is, oh, sorry. You see my music coming on?
We need some redemption.
A bit of Bach, right? That would do the trick. Yeah, so I mean, that's a stunning piece of archival footage from 1967, and you know, with that switch, you know, from massacres to bad as things are, the good news is Indonesia has massive wealth, and the plantations are are back, right? Foreign capitalists are back, and interesting, the recount of the deficiencies under the during the 60s. Production remained the same, but costs rose because workers were provided with increased wages, houses, and other things that one might think were rather good for citizens, but were at the expense of corporate profits. So, okay, so one might like to set that in the past and say, that was 1966, 1967. What can we make of this now? To what extent has this moment, or the desire of plantation corporations and their corporate and crony allies to expand and extract the wealth of Indonesia, formed in this period a particular kind of regime which has a bearing on the question of rights. So clearly, the communists and their rights, they were actually massacred and held at gunpoint. But what next? This idea that there's a wake, there's something which continues and persists after these events, which we ought to pay attention to. So here we would argue that plantations and the capacity to issue corporate concessions were the prize of the military coup. It had happened almost immediately that the new order started again to issue concessions, and it was clearly one of the interests of the foreign corporations and their supporting governments in supporting the coup. As the reporter notes, under Suharto, relations with foreign corporations were quickly restored, and plantations resumed operation right away, with the military closely involved. What also changed here? So the counterforce, which had been supplied by plantation workers, peasants, and other mobilized groups during the 50s, was violently eradicated. And we would argue that to this day, it is really still not recovered. The absence of a counterforce, an effective counterforce, accounts for the weak state of workers and villagers in the plantation zone that we studied. It accounts for why villagers can still be robbed of their land, why workers can still be, kicked around and tossed out, as they say, like old rags. They are not effective as a counterforce to the regime that's in place. And there's a history to that. There's a reason for that. There was a time at which they were, in fact, becoming a successful counterforce, and that was stopped. And, the state of objection that we discovered at the local level is a consequence of that eradication. This also accounts, one could say, to bring it really to the contemporary period, for the 2020 omnibus law, a big law which was passed in Indonesia during the past year, that deeply eroded land, environmental and worker rights, and further entrenched corporate dominance of the economy. And there were street protests. There were lots of brave and valiant protest people organized for petitions and so on. But effectively, they were unable to stop it. The law still was passed. So since 1965, we would argue, what has prevailed in Indonesia is a regime of impunity. What that means is that officials, politicians, military men, and their corporate allies can basically take what they want. Citizens have rights on paper, but in practice, they have no means to hold powerful individuals, corporations, and even politicians to account. So as we know, effective citizenship requires not only the letter of the law, but the effective capacity to hold, to make claims under the law and to hold people who do you harm to account for that harm. Decades after the 65-66 massacres, workers and villagers in Indonesia still do not have the organizational strength to reach and the reach to change the form of the state. This is the world that emerges in the wake of the plantation. So to recap my argument, in Indonesia, plantations have been world-making at the national scale as well as locally. They've configured the form of the state and the very limited nature of Indonesian citizenship. They have been key elements in the sedimentation of racialized practices, laws, and social divides that remain deeply entrenched. Ordinary people are not enfranchised citizens. They have legal rights, but in practice, they are treated as social inferiors, at best as supplicants or wards, at worst as racialized others, small people who can be kicked around. The acute social divides and the regime of impunity that emerged in the wake of the plantation have become naturalized. They are taken for granted as just the way that things are. This, I would suggest, is Indonesia's plantation Ocean, and it's one that's overdue for a reckoning. Thank you.